Hi, so today we're going to be doing kind of a split video, which is both going to be educational to help people understand, but equally it's going to be one of my thought-provoking content which we have to handle sensitively, and we have to be in a space where we are willing to consider just taking some time away if we're feeling triggered and activated and coming back, and also not arguing with each other in the comment section. So I am going to be initially talking about narcissism as well as autism and how there are some stark differences, but there are some overlap which cause confusion to some people. And I'm sure you could agree, the word narcissist is thrown around a hell of a lot. And do people truly know what that means? Like, if you really said, can you sit down and tell me exactly what that means? Could they tell you? And how, when the overlaps are happening, could you differentiate? Because I think that's another important component. But I'm going to also share some content from some other people who have touched on a subject that has opened up a doorway in my mind and I've gone down the rabbit hole of, and I would like to explore with you, my lovely community on YouTube, which is there a pipeline between autism and narcissism? And I know from the jump, anybody who lives inside this community, so you're autistic like me, that might be quite jarring and quite triggering. But believe me when I say I'm not throwing out any accusations. I just want to explore what possibilities live there, and it helps us become more informed and do better and know better. And I just want to preempt that narcissism, if there is a pipeline, because again, you get to decide from what you hear, what you learn, it doesn't mean it's the only pipeline to narcissism.
So it's ironic. On this extreme, you have the guy who actually feels your feelings, but you feel that he can't relate to you and you feel very frustrated around him. On the other extreme, you have this guy who doesn't feel what you're feeling, can't feel what you're feeling, but you feel so validated by him. So if we're going to use convenient terms, and I don't mean this in any clinical sense, but colloquially, we'll call one extreme the autistic and we'll call the other the narcissistic. The autistic has no cognitive empathy, but he has incredible real empathy, emotional empathy. He's an antenna for your emotions, but you don't feel that. So he's isolated, you're isolated, there's a breakdown in communication, loneliness, and resentment. The narcissistic personality, he has incredible cognitive empathy. He knows what makes people feel certain ways. He just doesn't actually feel it. And that's why he's able to exploit it, because it's no skin off his nose. It doesn't hurt him that you're hurting. To the contrary, it's to his advantage when he's around emotionally vulnerable people. So you have these two opposite types. And if you're quote unquote normal, meaning neurotypical, it would behoove you to learn about these two different characters who you're going to meet in your lifetime. And
I know of many, many people who are absolutely not neurodivergent, and they absolutely have either experienced somebody who is or are somebody who is very much ticking many of the criteria for being a narcissist, although I would say it's probably quite underdiagnosed. Anyway, so what we're going to start with is what creates a narcissist, and then I'm going to go into basically autism and what we know to be true so far about autism. And then I'm going to talk about this content, and then I'm going to move into both the similarities and the overlap and what we can basically do about that. Anybody who is new here, hi, I'm Jade, welcome. And if you are somebody who's already here, welcome back. So I am a person-centered private therapist, and I have a lovely healing space which I'm recording in right now. And I make content that is both educational, thought-provoking, mental health related, autism related. So if that is your thing, please stick around, like and subscribe. So I am going to be reading from my book like I always do, so I don't have to make a gazillion videos and not get all of the content that I truly have inside of me out. So I want to talk about what is or what makes a narcissist, although there are some genetical components that are suggested to contribute to people being more have a more predisposition to becoming a narcissist. There is many research that suggests it is a component of genetics, environment, and social factors, and that parents can play a huge role in a child becoming a narcissist. Anybody who is a parent, I am a parent, I've recently done a video on parenting, and we already put a lot of pressure on ourselves, and we probably have a great fear of our children not thriving, not being happy, or not getting the best outcomes. So I know that this is a difficult subject to touch on, but I think that we can't do anything if we're in the dark, but we can the more that we know of something, we understand something, we look it directly in the eye, and we directly do the things that are necessary to avoid us heading in a destination that we don't truly want to be in. So the things that I find, and I've definitely seen this in my line of work, when I've worked in schools, and also just from what I can compile in terms of all the information that I found on this, there is kind of two categories of where a narcissist would emerge from the kind of social factors and the influence of how their life has gone and how that has impacted them ending up in the place where they are exhibiting or being diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder. So the first one, I imagine you will know and you will understand. But the second one, when I tell people, they don't believe me. But I would say that that is actually, I think this one was at a disproportional rate, but now this one is at a disproportional rate. So this one, the one that I think most people are familiar with, is raising children and them experiencing lots of neglect and abandonment, and they might receive things like conditional love, inconsistent love and attention, and this is something that can happen to any child, and sometimes, not always, the consequence of that can be as like a self-protective sort of measure. They end up having this coping strategy of becoming self-important and seeking validation and placing themselves up on this hierarchy of believing that they are better than other people. But the other side of this is the overvaluation of praising children. That's going to sound terrible, isn't it? But basically excessively praising children and sheltering them and basically giving them unearned praise where they're not able to establish a real and normal and healthy self-esteem from that place. Where, let me give you an example of that because I think it might make it a little bit easier. Say, for example, your toddler is walking around and everything that they do, you have this incessant amount of, and we all love our kids, so that's not what I'm talking about, but you have this incessant amount of everything you do is incredible, and you, no matter what you do, you will have that level of praise being given, and almost that you hold a position above anybody and everybody. That's when we get a problem. And that is not the framework of what many people believe narcissism is born out of. But I can say when I worked in schools that one is probably the most dominant one in society at this current moment. Or in my mind, from what I've come into contact with, it doesn't mean that that's the same all over the world. And it ends up generating this sense of entitlement, this sense of self-importance above everybody, and it creates a disconnect from their empathy towards other people and towards what role they believe they have in society and in the world in general that doesn't have them at the center of it. And again, I say this as a way to help us guide ourselves and our children if we are parents or if we plan on being parents. I know I said this in my last video, but it depends if you've watched it. This is the exact reason why I don't always subtract my needs from the dynamic between me and my children. My children come above me, of course they do. I am the parent. They did not choose to be born. They absolutely should have my love, care, support, always and above everything. However, I don't want them to ever not understand, one, how emotions work, how empathy works, how other people and other components come into play. And actually, we're social creatures. So the truth is that anybody that we're encouraging to see themselves as the center of the universe and that they're the only ones that matters, you're causing a disconnect for them, and they don't get to thrive in the sense of being a social creature and having a social need. And the other things that kind of further perpetuate narcissism are the societal norms and media, who prioritize things like material success and appearance and things like that. And they just basically reinforce the narcissistic traits and behaviours. And then you've also got the inherited component, which is basically the genetical factor that I spoke about a little bit earlier, which is basically that you can have a genetical predisposition to be more sort of self-centered or arrogant or above other people, and believing that you are better than other people. And again, it doesn't necessarily mean that if you do have that genetical factor at play that you are going to be a narcissist, but it certainly means that it can contribute to, if any of the other factors are going on, the outcome of that, of you becoming a narcissist, could increase. Now let's move on to autism. So again, that's my bread and butter, and that's what most of my content has been on for quite a long time now. So autism is a neurodevelopmental condition, and it is, although they don't truly know because they can't say factually the cause, it's obviously the developmental part of the brain and how that exhibits certain things like social communication difficulties, sensory increases or decreases, and things like repetitive behaviour. And there is an element now that is backed up within research that suggests that if there is autism in your family, it is there because has already been in your family, as in it can be genetically passed on. And there was some research, and again, please, anybody watching this who can give me a better insight into this, that said environmental factors do come to play also, from their vague conclusion of where autism derives from. So please do let me know more about that, because I couldn't quite grasp that, and I would probably need to do a little bit more research on that. But basically, the long and short of it is that autism is the way that the brain is wired up, and there is some element of a genetical component that can be passed on from one generation to the next. But I think that the most important thing to kind of mention at this point is that autism doesn't inherently involve moral or ethical judgment or ill intent. So from that, just the base platform of having autism, even if, say for example, you might have an empathy difference, for example, and you couldn't quite understand something, there's no ill intent behind that. There is just sort of a confusion, a lack of clarity, a lack of understanding in relation to that. I will go into that in more detail. And I think that's what the key difference is in terms of differentiating between the two. Although, like I say, I will go through the similarities and the overlap specifically in a moment, which will be the things like the empathy. However, now I'm going to move on to the more controversial stuff. And before I do, I want you to consider, and I think that for the most part, most autistic people I know are really good at this, so fingers crossed, to approach this with an open mind and an information-based, logical approach, rather than assuming that that means something negative or bad about any of us, because it doesn't, because the vast majority of us do not fall into this category. We're very much self-aware. The fact that you're sat watching this already suggests that, and that you are in a place where you are always gaining information to basically better redirect ourselves. So I come across this video and I'm going to input it here.
That autistic people are more likely to become narcissists because of the fact that they have more needs. And so they are more likely to overwhelm their caregivers with their needs. They are more likely to get the messaging that their needs are too much or not okay, and then develop the adaptations of manipulating people and performing emotions and moving things around on a chessboard in order to get their needs met. Narcissism is created out of someone who learned early on that they would not and could not get their needs met and get the validation and love that they needed through normal means. And so they moved on to emotional manipulations. All kinds of people have this adaptation. Some people become people pleasers around it, and some people become manipulators. And it just depends on how connected you are to your human empathy. If you decided to disconnect from your human empathy and you have a protector part around that, then you became more narcissistic.
And here is a guy who is a diagnosed, which again I think is relatively rare, narcissist with narcissistic personality disorder. And he talks about how he actually agrees with this. So watch this.
Well, being raised by an undiagnosed autistic parent is a lot like being raised by a narcissistic parent.
So I'm actually a diagnosed narcissist who was actually raised by somebody with autism and OCD. And I hope I don't get too much hate for saying this, but I actually agree with that creator. I do think, at least from the perspective of a child and how their needs are getting met, being raised by a narcissist and then somebody who's autistic can seem very similar.
So I found it really interesting, and again, something that I'd not really thought about until it was presented to me, but I was able to approach it in the way that I suggested that we all do, which was, what could I learn from this and what could I take away, and what things do make sense, which would be, take in mind these two people are talking from experience, one with autism and narcissism, and then one with narcissism and the parental input of a parent who is neurodivergent, and also I'm assuming a parent who is neurotypical, what he deemed her to be an attention seeker, which causes combination for him, which would suggest the environmental factors and the genetical factors that we spoke about. But I think that the difficulty is that sometimes children, regardless of whether the person is doing it with ill intent or bad intent, they don't always know why they're not getting their needs met. So he spoke about that his dad was quite cold, and obviously as a child who maybe needed something warmer, something more giving, and also him having that sort of attention seeking trait, it wasn't enough for him. It wasn't enough for him, and it pushed him past the threshold where I imagine he began to disconnect from his empathy, or never formed it in the first place, and went on to obviously have the experiences that he did, and how he believes that his dad contributed to that. We can't ignore that. We can't ignore that there might be many people who are experiencing this who had a coldness from parents. And could that live anywhere? Could that live inside the autistic community? Yes, it could, but it could also live in the neurotypical community too. I know many great parents who live on either side who are neurodivergent or neurotypical. I think it comes down to awareness, and I think that's the importance of making this video. That if dad was cold and son felt like he wasn't getting enough love, there is going to be a consequence to that. And we have to speak about it. And the girl basically goes on to talk about, is the dial up, which is basically, that's how I interpreted it, which is the experiences of particularly undiagnosed adults moving through life, becoming parents, and because they have such a lack of understanding, which I think is really vital to this argument or debate or discussion, which is, because they're undiagnosed, they're not actually even able to meet their own needs, which means that they can then never really truly meet the needs of their children. And I'm wondering if there's a lot of people who might end up watching this who can relate to that too. And it's the importance of why, regardless of the way that councils are running and they're pushing the agenda of diagnosis is not necessary, this says it is necessary. It is necessary to understand yourself and the impacts of how your biology and wiring works, and how then when you can take care of yourself, you can take care of your children more effectively. And ultimately what I was going on to say before, which is if a neurodivergent parent who is undiagnosed has an increased level of need, but that it's not being met, it's being completely ignored probably, in fact, they are probably going to be overstimulated, dysregulated, and extremely disconnected at maybe, possibly, a disproportional rate to the rest of society. And then what happens if they go on to have children? What happens then? We have to surely consider that. And again, I say this sensitively because I'm not in any way throwing accusations around, but I'm just wondering whether it will help a few things slot into place that certainly helped clarify some things in my mind. But I also want to stress that the traits of an undiagnosed parent can still be, regardless of being the reason, them having valid reason for that being that way, can still be very much present within the neurotypical community and just the community in general, which I see all of the time. I see children who are struggling because dad is absent, and there is no, we can't say for definite, but there is no reason for that other than they made a choice that they didn't want to be a consistent parent, or they just decided it wasn't for them. And there can be many things that can be experienced that fall into that neglect side of, and abandonment side of, the potentials of developing narcissism that very much can live anywhere. And I can't stress that enough. I'm only saying this to explore the idea of, is it possible that it lives in two communities, not just one? I want to go on to what the confusion can be sometimes, because I think, like I say, everybody throws around the word narcissism, and sometimes people believe that people are narcissists because they have autistic traits present, and maybe also that somebody who is autistic maybe isn't necessarily getting the label of narcissist, even though they could quite possibly have fallen over into that category. So I wanted to speak about basically the confusion and the overlap, and how that looks inside of those things, and also the differences, to just help it kind of wrap it up in a nice little bow. So the overlap would be both the narcissist individual and the autistic individual. They may have an empathy difference, but the empathy difference that basically lives within autism is due to, not because they don't want to understand, it's normally due to kind of that social communication difficulty, and it doesn't have any sort of ill intent behind it. Whereas the lack of empathy that lives inside narcissism is a lack of empathy and a lack of remorse that is intentionally there, in the sense of they will do things to benefit self, and they feel towards self and self-preservation, but they certainly do not feel towards the other individual and the outcomes for that individual. The other overlap would be social differences. So the differences, again, in autism would be due to social communication. So it could be that actually you really struggle, even if you mask well, you really, really struggle, and it takes a lot of effort and understanding to try your best to fit in that social situation. Whereas the social communication difficulties of somebody with narcissism, or anything in the dark tetrad, would be that the consequences of the actions and the behaviours you take, and then you having to basically, the lack of consideration, but also the deliberate intent of your behaviour and your actions, and then you basically having some sort of social or relationship breakdown because of that. The other overlap would be repetitive behaviours. So repetitive behaviours, again, within autism, I'm pretty sure you'll know all these, but again, they're more for self-regulation and therefore like sensory nervous system regulation. whereas repetitive behaviours within the narcissistic personality and person is more to do with manipulative patterns and for personal gain. And there can be a bluntness and a directness that lives inside both communities too. And again, within autism, it would be more to do with the direct line of communication, and again could be social difficulties in terms of not necessarily understanding how that might be received, but it can also be that you just prefer things to just be said as they are meant and as they are intended, rather than flowering it up and causing confusion along the way. Whereas the directness and bluntness can be used as a tool to make people feel bad or to make them feel confused, where gaslighting might be happening, and basically the kind of deterioration of somebody's self-esteem and mental health can be used with their line of like bluntness and rudeness to basically chip away at somebody and cause direct harm and direct intent. And the other similarity would be the resistance to change. Resistance to change within obviously autism is more routine and to do with having a predictable outcome and them needing that for, again, self-regulation, whereas the resistance to change within narcissism is to remain in control and have a sense of power, that having that strong desire to basically always remain in that position that is a couple of steps ahead of the person that they deem is below them. So now moving on to the differences, because I think this is probably, if I was watching, what I'd be waiting for, so that I again had the right amount of knowledge so that I could differentiate between the two. Not that we go around diagnosing people, but again, we all have to come into contact with people who are going to fit into either one of these categories, and it is best for us to be able to stop throwing a word around willy-nilly, because by the way, it is suggested that we all have some level of narcissistic traits, apparently. Again, tell me what you think to that. I would have to reflect on that question because I would want to give you an honest answer and I haven't actually thought about it. The differences would be the nature of the traits. I can't stress that one enough. Again, I have broke down the nature of how these traits, even if they have similarities, are not the same at the core of how they function and how they operate. But I think that the nature of the traits of somebody with narcissism is often to do with manipulation, control, power, and remaining above anybody at all costs. Whereas the nature of any trait within autism is often to do with self-regulation, not becoming overstimulated, trying to cope, trying to keep safe within a world that they don't feel like is necessarily set up for them. The social interaction is different too. So what you might find, I actually watched a video, I might even try to input it without any copyright because it is on YouTube, but it was how to spot a sociopath. And it was a really, really interesting video, and I will put the link below.
You can spot the psychopath. To answer that question, I've gathered these 11 people. 10 of them are normal, but one of them is a psychopath.
My name is Eli.
Hey, I'm Jay.
And I'm not.
I am not.
And I am not.
I am not a psychopath.
These guys will have 5 rounds to ask each other questions and try to sniff out who's the psychopath.
But the thing that I found really interesting about this is it gave really good insight into the social interaction differences between somebody who is in the dark tetrad, so that would be your narcissism, your sort of psychopath, your sociopath, your Machiavellianism, your sadism, and how it looks different to what people think. People think that I'd be able to spot it a mile off, and I've got a video for that too. Because I find this really interesting. I think that the more outcast you are, and the more of an observer you become, the more actually you can maybe pick up on these things. But that being said, I think that when you're not involved, basically, in the group, because when you're in the middle of the group, you can't see the wood for the trees, as the saying is, and you get confused by the dynamic. But when you're out of it and you're observing it, it's easier to observe it and notice it. And I think that that's something true within our community as well. However, let me know if you'd be interested in that video. The social interaction differences basically would be that you might find, even if you think that somebody with autism, or you enjoy the social interaction of somebody with autism, it it doesn't come as naturally and as easily and as effortlessly as it comes to the average person, just a neurotypical person. But in terms of how that is received, it's a mixed bag. For the most part, they're ostracized, they're picked up within seconds, and people can tell you that there's something different about them, but they can't tell you why, but they know that they kind of want to outcast it, and I know that many of us can relate to that. But it's the idea that basically social interaction is actually quite a great struggle for people in the autistic community. No matter how well they've tried to master it, it's not something that isn't pretty much exhausting. And whereas the social interaction of somebody who is a narcissist, or like I say, anybody in the dark tetrad, you'll be surprised how charismatic they are and how almost captivating they are. If anybody has watched The Traitors in the UK, Paul is a great example of this, and actually Harry ended up being a great example of this, where they was very, very good at manipulating and getting everything exactly on side in the way that they needed to. And that is one of the huge differences between the two. And don't get me wrong, there is something called covert narcissism, where they're often the victim, but they place themselves in like this higher sort of still grandiose sort of self-important place. But again, they would still have an element of being able to have people gravitate towards them quite a disproportionate rate, really. And the third one would be intention. So say, for example, somebody, like I say, with autism lacked empathy in a moment where they feel the emotional empathy of something. So they feel sad for that person, but they don't know how to cognitively get that across to them. The intent behind that is not malice. It is not vindictive. It is not manipulative. Whereas the intent behind how a person, because the thing is, here's something to finish on. In narcissism, even though they lack empathy, they don't lack the ability to be able to project empathy. So the intent is to use empathy to their advantage and to use it to manipulate the people around them, although they don't truly actually feel it inside. But tell me what you think to this. Did you find this video interesting? Do you agree that it can live in both communities? And do we need to be more mindful of how narcissism is born in the middle of all these components? I'd love to know your thoughts. Remember to be sensitive in the comments and be kind, because I just don't like it when people are just deliberately disgusting and cruel. And it's probably not a good one to try and put in the underneath a narcissism video. Just joking. Anyway, take care and I'll speak to you soon.